I remember the exact moment my daughter decided I was nothing more than an extra mouth to feed. "You can't just sit here forever, Mom," she said across the dinner table. "We're already stretched thin. You're basically an extra mouth in this house." My son-in-law didn't say a word. He just kept chewing his steak, staring down at his plate like the conversation had nothing to do with him. I sat there quietly, my hands folded in my lap, feeling the words settle over the table like cold rain. An extra mouth. 70 years on this earth, and that was what I had become. I moved out without arguing, without crying, without making a scene. The next morning, I packed my suitcase and closed the door behind me. But what my daughter didn't know was this. The woman she called an extra mouth still had a few things left to say and a few things left to do. Before I continue, I want to say something. I'm glad you're here. Follow my story until the end, and tell me in the comments what city you're watching from. I've always been curious how far stories like mine can travel. Now let me take you back to that evening. The dining room smelled like garlic butter and roasted chicken. My daughter, Karen, always cooked elaborate meals when she wanted to pretend everything in the house was normal. The table was set with heavy white plates and wine glasses that caught the warm light from the chandelier. Outside the window, the early autumn sky was fading into that deep blue color that comes just before night. It should have felt like home, but it didn't. Not anymore. Karen sat across from me, her shoulders stiff, tapping her fork lightly against the edge of her plate. My son-in-law Mark sat beside her, scrolling through something on his phone between bites. No one looked at me. Not really. That's when Karen cleared her throat. "Mom, we need to talk about something." Those words always mean trouble. I learned that a long time ago. I set my napkin down slowly. "What is it, honey?" I asked. Her eyes flicked toward Mark, then back to me. For a moment, she hesitated, as if she was trying to decide how blunt she wanted to be. Then she said it. "You can't stay here forever." The sentence hung in the air like smoke. I blinked once, trying to process it. I thought, "We agreed I'd stay for a little while," I said carefully. My husband had died only 3 months earlier. 43 years of marriage ended with a heart attack in the kitchen one quiet Sunday morning. The house we had lived in for decades suddenly felt too big, too quiet. Every room reminded me of him. Karen had been the one who suggested I move in. "Come stay with us for a while, Mom," she'd said over the phone. "You shouldn't be alone right now." At the time, it had sounded like kindness. Now, sitting across from her at that dinner table, I realized kindness had an expiration date. Karen sighed loudly, like someone forced to explain something obvious. "Mom, you eat our food, you use the utilities, and you're here all day. Mark and I have expenses too." Her tone wasn't angry. It was worse than that. It was practical, like she was talking about a broken appliance. I felt my fingers tighten around the edge of the table. "I buy groceries," I said softly. "That's not the point," she replied immediately. Mark finally looked up from his plate, but he didn't say anything. Karen leaned back in her chair. "The point is we can't keep supporting another adult. You're basically an extra mouth." There it was. The phrase landed with a dull, final weight. An extra mouth. I looked down at my hands. The skin had grown thin over the years, the veins rising like blue threads beneath the surface. These were the same hands that had packed Karen's school lunches every morning for 12 years. The same hands that had stayed up late sewing Halloween costumes. The same hands that held her when she cried the night her first boyfriend broke her heart. But to her now, they were just another pair of hands reaching for food at the table. "Mom," Karen continued, softening her voice slightly, "we're not saying you have to leave tonight." That almost made me laugh. Almost. "But you should start figuring something out," she added. "Maybe a senior apartment or something." Senior apartment. Another label. Another way of saying, not our problem. I glanced at Mark. He quickly looked away. The silence in the room stretched longer than it should have. Finally, I nodded once. "I understand," I said. Karen seemed relieved. She took a sip of wine and relaxed back into her chair. "Good," she said. "I'm glad we can be adults about this." Adults. I almost asked her when exactly I had stopped being one. But I didn't. Instead, I finished my meal quietly. Every bite tasted like cardboard. Later that night, I sat on the edge of the bed in the small guest room they had given me. The room was neat and carefully decorated, but it never truly felt like mine. A single suitcase rested on the floor beside the dresser. I stared at it for a long time. Then I stood up and started packing. I folded my sweaters carefully, one by one. The silence of the house wrapped around me like a blanket. Down the hall, I could hear Karen laughing softly at something on television. For a moment, I wondered if she even remembered the words she had said earlier. Extra mouth. It's funny how certain phrases can echo inside your mind long after they're spoken. I zipped the suitcase closed. The sound seemed louder than it should have been. At the door, I paused and looked around the room one last time. 3 months earlier, I had arrived here believing I still had a place in my daughter's life. Now I understood something important. I had mistaken temporary kindness for permanent belonging. The next morning, I left before they woke up. The sun had barely risen, and the air outside carried that crisp October chill. My suitcase rolled behind me as I walked down the driveway. I didn't leave a note. There was nothing left to say. But as I reached the sidewalk, one thought settled quietly into my mind. Karen believed I was nothing more than a burden, an extra mouth. What she didn't realize was that life has a strange way of shifting power. And sometimes, the people you push out of your home end up holding the keys to the building you live in. The first night after I left Karen's house, I slept in a small roadside motel about 20 miles away. It wasn't the kind of place anyone chose for comfort. The carpet smelled faintly of cleaning chemicals, and the air conditioner rattled every few minutes like it was arguing with the wall. But it was quiet, and for the first time in weeks, I didn't feel like I was taking up space that someone else resented. I set my suitcase on the narrow bed and sat beside it for a long time. 70 years old, widowed, and suddenly starting over. The thought should have frightened me. Strangely, it didn't. Grief had already done the worst thing life could do to me. Losing my husband had hollowed out a space inside me that nothing else could quite match. Compared to that silence, being called an extra mouth almost felt small. Still, the words stayed with me. Extra mouth. I heard them again when I ordered coffee at the motel's small breakfast counter the next morning. I heard them when I counted the bills in my wallet. And I heard them when I stepped outside and felt the cold October air brush across my face. For 3 months after my husband died, I had tried very hard not to think about money. Karen had insisted I move in quickly. Everything happened so fast. The funeral, the paperwork, the quiet, empty house we had shared for decades. I never stopped to take a real look at the things my husband had left behind. Not the bank statements. Not the investment folders. Not the letters from his attorney. Back then, I didn't have the energy. But sitting alone in that motel room, something began to shift in my mind. My husband, Robert, had never been careless with money. Not once in 43 years. He worked as a building contractor most of his life. Not a flashy job, but steady, reliable. The kind of work where you learn the value of every dollar that passed through your hands. Robert used to say something whenever we talked about retirement. Brick lasts longer than paper, he'd tell me with a quiet smile. At the time, I thought he just meant houses were a good investment. Now I wondered if he meant something more. I opened my suitcase and pulled out the folder I had packed before leaving Karen's house. It was thick with documents I hadn't read yet. Insurance letters, bank envelopes, a business card from Robert's attorney, a man named Mr. Thompson, who had handled our legal paperwork for years. I turned the card over in my hand. For a long moment, I simply stared at it. Karen believed I had nowhere to go. No resources. No options. Just an extra mouth looking for another table to sit at. But Robert had spent his entire life planning for the future. And suddenly I had a quiet, growing feeling that there were things about that future my daughter didn't know. I picked up the motel phone and dialed the number printed on the card. The phone rang 3 times before someone answered. Thompson and Green Law Office. The woman's voice sounded calm and professional. My name is Margaret Collins, I said. I'm calling about my husband, Robert Collins. Mr. Thompson handled some of his paperwork. There was a brief pause as I heard typing on the other end. Oh yes, Mrs. Collins, she replied a moment later. Mr. Thompson asked us to contact you after the estate paperwork was finalized. Would you like to schedule a meeting? I hesitated for a second. Until that moment, everything about Robert's estate had felt distant. Abstract. Like a stack of documents someone else would eventually sort out. But now things were different. Yes, I said quietly. I think I would. We scheduled the appointment for the following morning. After hanging up the phone, I sat on the edge of the motel bed again. Outside the window, cars moved slowly along the highway. The steady hum of traffic filled the quiet room. For the first time since leaving Karen's house, I felt something other than sadness. Curiosity. Robert had always been a careful man. He kept folders for everything. taxes, property papers, insurance forms. Even the smallest repair receipt had its own place in his filing cabinet. I remembered how he used to sit at the kitchen table late at night with a calculator and a yellow legal pad. Planning, tracking, preparing. At the time, I never paid much attention. Robert enjoyed numbers the same way some people enjoy crossword puzzles. But now those quiet habits started to look different, more intentional. The next morning I arrived at Mr. Thompson's office just before 9. It was a small brick building near the courthouse downtown. I had been there once before, years ago, when Robert updated our will. The receptionist greeted me politely and asked me to take a seat. The waiting room smelled faintly of coffee and old books. Framed certificates lined the walls. A few minutes later, a tall man with gray hair stepped out of the hallway. "Mrs. Collins," he said warmly. "It's good to see you again. I'm sorry it's under these circumstances." "Thank you," I replied. He guided me into his office and closed the door behind us. For a moment we spoke about Robert, about the funeral, about how sudden the heart attack had been. Then Mr. Thompson opened a thick folder on his desk. "Your husband was very organized," he said. "That sounds like Robert," I answered. The lawyer nodded slightly. "Yes," he continued. "And because of that, there are a few things I believe you should know about." He slid several documents across the desk toward me. Bank statements, property records, investment papers. At first the numbers didn't fully register in my mind. But as my eyes moved across the pages, something slowly began to sink in. Robert hadn't just left behind savings. He had left behind assets. Real ones. Buildings. Properties. Rental income accounts. I looked up at Mr. Thompson. "I didn't know about any of this," I admitted. "That was intentional," he said gently. "Robert wanted to handle the business side himself. He always said he'd explain everything when the time came." He leaned back slightly in his chair. "And Mrs. Collins, that time has come." In that quiet office, surrounded by folders my husband had prepared years ago, I suddenly realized something important. Karen thought I had nowhere to go. But Robert had spent decades building something solid. Something made of brick. And brick, as he always said, lasts longer than paper. Mr. Thompson let me take my time with the documents. He didn't rush me. He didn't explain too much either. He simply sat across the desk with his hands folded, watching quietly while I read through the pages my husband had prepared years before his death. Property records, rental income statements, maintenance contracts. Robert had organized everything neatly. Each property had its own section, its own set of notes written in his careful handwriting. I recognized that handwriting instantly. 43 years of marriage gives you that kind of familiarity. One of the folders caught my attention. It was thinner than the others, but marked with a small yellow tab. Mr. Thompson noticed where my eyes stopped. "That one was Robert's most recent investment," he said. I opened the folder slowly. Inside were documents for a small apartment building on the east side of town. 8 units. 3 floors. A modest place, according to the photos attached to the paperwork. Brick exterior. Narrow balconies. A small parking lot behind the building. Nothing fancy, but the location was good. Close to downtown. Reliable tenants. Stable income. I flipped through the papers carefully. Robert had purchased the building several years earlier through a partnership. According to the documents, the other partner had recently decided to sell his remaining share. Mr. Thompson spoke again. "Your husband owned 50% of that building," he explained. "When his partner decided to retire, Robert had the option to purchase the remaining share." I looked up from the folder. "Did he?" The lawyer shook his head slightly. "No. He passed away before completing the transaction." He slid another document toward me. "But the option transferred to you." I stared down at the paper. The numbers printed on it were larger than anything I had personally handled before. The purchase price. The expected rental income. Projected increases over the next few years. It was a business decision. A serious one. I leaned back in the chair and took a slow breath. Robert used to talk about buildings the way other people talk about family history. Every brick mattered. Every foundation told a story. He believed in things you could stand on. Things that didn't disappear overnight. "Do you know the building?" Mr. Thompson asked. I looked again at the address printed at the top of the page. The street name felt strangely familiar. Then the realization came quietly, almost gently. I had been there before. More than once. In fact, my daughter lived there. Karen and her husband Mark had rented an apartment in that building for the past 4 years. They always talked about how convenient the location was. Close to Mark's job. Reasonable rent. I remembered visiting them there for Sunday dinners not long ago, sitting at their small kitchen table, watching Karen complain about grocery prices, listening to Mark talk about how landlords always raised rent eventually. At the time, I never imagined Robert had anything to do with that building. Now I knew something Karen didn't. Her landlord was preparing to sell, and my husband had quietly arranged the possibility for me to buy. Mr. Thompson folded his hands again. "There's no pressure, Mrs. Collins," he said calmly. "But if you decide to proceed, the paperwork can be completed fairly quickly." I closed the folder slowly. Only 2 days earlier, my daughter had called me an extra mouth. Someone who cost too much. Someone who needed to leave. Now I was sitting in a lawyer's office holding documents that could make me the owner of the building she lived in. Life has a strange sense of timing. And for the first time since leaving Karen's house, I began to see a different kind of future forming. I didn't give Mr. Thompson my answer right away. Instead, I asked him for a copy of the documents so I could think about it. He nodded and slid the folder into a large envelope. "Take your time," he said. "But the seller is motivated. If you decide to buy the remaining share, it would make you the sole owner of the building." Sole owner. The phrase stayed in my mind as I walked out of the office. Outside, the morning sun had climbed higher, warming the sidewalks around the courthouse square. People hurried past with briefcases and coffee cups, moving through their day without noticing the quiet shift that had just happened in mine. 2 days ago, I had been standing on my daughter's driveway with a suitcase. Now I was holding the opportunity to own the building she lived in. Life moves strangely sometimes. I returned to the motel and spread the documents across the small table near the window. For the next hour, I read everything carefully. Robert had left notes in the margins of several pages. Small comments written in blue ink. Good tenants. Stable neighborhood. Rent below market. Room to adjust later. I could almost hear his voice when I read those words. Robert had always believed in preparation. He used to tell me something whenever we talked about investments. "Real estate isn't about today," he'd say. "It's about 20 years from now." Back then, I thought he was just being practical. Now I understood something deeper. He had been building security. Quietly. Patiently. For both of us. I looked again at the address on the property documents. Karen's building. I remembered the small balcony outside her apartment. The narrow staircase that led up to the second floor. The way the evening sunlight hit the brick walls when we sat outside after dinner. She had complained about the landlord before. "Nice enough guy," she'd said once. "But he'll probably raise the rent someday like they all do." At the time, I just nodded and listened. I never imagined that one day I might be the one making those decisions. I leaned back in the chair and stared out the window. The truth was, I didn't feel angry. Not in the loud, explosive way people imagine when they talk about revenge. What I felt was something quieter. Clarity. Karen had made her position very clear at that dinner table. I was an extra mouth. An expense. Someone who didn't belong in her home. She had spoken those words calmly, like they were just another practical decision. Now I was facing one of my own. I picked up the phone and called Mr. Thompson's office again. He answered this time. "Mrs. Collins," he said, "have you had a chance to review the documents?" "Yes," I replied. There was a brief pause on the line. "And?" he asked gently. I looked down at Robert's notes one more time. Then I gave him my answer. "Let's move forward," I said. On the other end of the phone, I could almost hear the small smile in his voice. "Very well," he said. "I'll begin preparing the purchase agreement." When I hung up, the motel room felt strangely quiet again. But something had changed. Karen believed she had solved her problem by pushing me out of her house. What she didn't realize yet was that I had just taken the first step toward becoming her landlord. The next few days moved quietly. Mr. Thompson handled most of the paperwork. My role was mostly to read, sign, and ask questions when something didn't make sense. But every step of the process reminded me just how carefully Robert had planned things. The purchase agreement arrived 2 days later. I met Mr. Thompson again at his office downtown. The same brick building. The same quiet waiting room with its faint smell of coffee and old books. This time, the folder he placed in front of me was thicker. "Everything is ready," he said. "Once these documents are signed, the remaining share of the building transfers to you." I flipped through the pages slowly. The legal language was dense, but Mr. Thompson explained each section patiently. Ownership transfer. Maintenance responsibilities. Tenant agreements. At the bottom of the final page was the line waiting for my signature. Margaret Collins. For a moment, I simply looked at the paper. Robert used to joke that signing contracts was the easiest part of owning property. The hard work comes later, he'd say. I smiled slightly at the memory. Then I picked up the pen. My hand moved slowly but steadily across the page. When I finished, Mr. Thompson gathered the documents and nodded. "Congratulations," he said. "You are now the sole owner of the property." Sole owner. The words felt different now. More real. More solid. Outside the office window, traffic moved steadily along the street. People walked past the courthouse steps, carrying on with their lives. None of them knew that a 70-year-old widow had just quietly become the owner of an apartment building. And that was exactly how I preferred it. Over the next week, a few practical matters needed attention. Mr. Thompson introduced me to the building's property manager, a man named Daniel who had been handling day-to-day operations for years. We met at the building itself one afternoon. Standing on the sidewalk, I looked up at the familiar brick walls. 3 stories, 8 apartments, balconies with white railings. I had visited this building many times before, but now I was seeing it differently. Daniel shook my hand politely. "Robert was a good partner," he said. "Very straightforward. I'm glad the building is staying in the family." Family. That word carried a strange weight now. Daniel walked me through the basics. Tenant records, maintenance schedules, current rent rates. The building was well maintained, but one thing stood out immediately. The rent. Daniel flipped through his notebook. "To be honest," he said carefully, "the previous owner kept the rent lower than most buildings in this neighborhood." "How much lower?" I asked. "About 30% below market value." 30%. That was a significant difference. Robert's notes in the folders suddenly made more sense. Room to adjust later. Daniel continued speaking. "Most landlords eventually increase the rent when the market shifts. Tenants usually expect it." I nodded slowly. As we walked past the staircase leading to the second floor, I recognized the familiar hallway. Karen's apartment was just around the corner. I didn't stop there. I didn't knock. There would be time for that later. For now, everything continued as normal. The tenants paid their rent. The building operated as it always had. And my daughter went about her life believing nothing had changed. But sometimes the biggest changes happen quietly, without announcements, without warning. And soon enough, Karen would learn something important. The extra mouth she pushed out of her house was now the person who owned the roof over hers. For the next 2 weeks, I didn't contact Karen. I didn't drive by her apartment. I didn't call. I didn't send a message. Life became quiet again, the way it had been after Robert passed away. Only this time, the quiet felt different. Purposeful. Most mornings I sat at the small table in my motel room with a cup of coffee and the building records Daniel had given me. Tenant lists, maintenance reports, rent history, page after page of numbers that slowly began to make sense. Robert had always said that understanding a building meant understanding the people who lived inside it. So I read carefully. 8 apartments. 7 tenants who had been there for years. And 1 unit that stood out immediately. Unit 2B. Karen and Mark. I looked at the rent column beside their names. $1,050 per month. Daniel had been right. For that neighborhood, the average rent was much higher. Closer to $1,500. Sometimes even more. I traced the number with my finger for a moment, thinking about the conversations I used to hear at their kitchen table. Karen complaining about grocery prices. Mark talking about how landlords always found ways to raise rent. At the time, those conversations had sounded like ordinary frustrations. Now they felt different. Now they sounded like predictions. Later that week, Daniel called me. "Mrs. Collins," he said, "there's something we should probably talk about." "What is it?" I asked. "The lease renewals." I listened quietly. Most of the tenants' leases were set to renew at the end of the month. That meant new contracts, new terms, and if the owner decided, new rent prices. "That's usually when adjustments happen," Daniel explained. "Adjustments," I repeated. He paused for a second before continuing. "Given the market right now, many owners would increase the rent." I didn't answer immediately. Outside the motel window, the afternoon sun had begun to sink lower in the sky. Cars passed along the road, their shadows stretching across the pavement. For a moment, my mind returned to that dinner table at Karen's house. The way she leaned back in her chair. The calm way she said the words. "You're basically an extra mouth." Not angry, not emotional, just practical. Like she was explaining a simple fact about the world. I realized something then. Karen hadn't meant to be cruel. In her mind, She had simply made a practical decision. So now I would do the same. Daniel, I said. Yes. What would the market rate be for those apartments? I heard papers shifting on his desk. For most of the units? Around $1,600 to $1,800. And Karen's apartment? I asked. About the same, he replied. I nodded slowly, even though he couldn't see me. Practical decisions. That's what this was. Nothing more. Prepare the new lease notices, I said calmly. With the updated rent. Daniel hesitated. Are you sure? He asked. Some tenants may be surprised. That's all right, I replied. After we hung up, the room became quiet again. I sat there for a long time, looking at the lease renewal dates on the papers in front of me. Karen believed she had solved her problem when she pushed me out of her house. But sometimes solutions have consequences. And very soon, my daughter was going to open her mailbox and discover that her rent had just changed. 3 days later, the notices went out. Daniel handled everything through the property management system the building had been using for years. Printed letters, email copies, official lease renewal documents. Nothing unusual, just routine paperwork. Each tenant received the same envelope. Inside was a simple notice explaining that their lease would renew at the end of the month, along with the updated rent amount. For most of the tenants, the increase was noticeable but reasonable. The new numbers brought their rent closer to the current market price. But one apartment saw a much larger jump. Unit 2B, Karen and Mark's apartment. Their rent had been $1,050 for years. The new lease listed the monthly rent as $3,000. Daniel had warned me it would cause a reaction. I suspected he was right. Still, the notices were sent exactly the same way they always had been. No drama. No announcements. Just a letter placed inside a mailbox. 2 days passed. Then my phone rang. I was sitting in a small diner near the motel, stirring sugar into my coffee, when Karen's name appeared on the screen. For a moment, I simply looked at it. She hadn't called me since the morning I left her house. Not once. Now suddenly she wanted to talk. I answered. Hello, Karen. Her voice came through immediately, sharp and tense. Mom, did you hear about this? I took a slow sip of coffee. Hear about what? Our rent, she said. The landlord just sent out new leases. They're insane. I waited quietly. Karen continued speaking quickly, her frustration spilling out. They raised it to $3,000 a month. $3,000. That's almost triple what we're paying now. Her voice carried the same disbelief people use when they think something unfair has happened to them. Did you call the office? I asked calmly. Of course I did, she replied. They said it's coming from the new owner. New owner. The words hung in the air for a moment. Karen sighed loudly into the phone. I swear, some landlords are just greedy, she said. They don't care about people. They just want money. I listened quietly. Across the diner, a waitress refilled someone's coffee cup. The soft clinking of dishes echoed faintly through the room. Karen kept talking. We might have to move if they don't fix this, she said. $3,000 is ridiculous. I could hear Mark's voice faintly in the background, asking questions. Karen covered the phone for a second while she answered him. Then she came back to me. Mom, have you heard anything about this building being sold recently? She asked. There was a brief pause before I responded. Yes, I said. I heard something about that. Well, whoever bought it is going to lose half their tenants if they keep this up, Karen said angrily. I set my coffee cup down on the table. For a moment, I considered telling her the truth right then. But some things are better understood in person. Maybe you should speak with the new owner, I said calmly. Karen laughed bitterly. Yeah, I'd love to, she replied. I'd ask them what kind of person triples the rent on working families. I looked out the diner window at the quiet street. Then I answered. You might get that chance sooner than you think. Karen didn't understand what I meant. Not yet, but very soon she would. The next morning, Daniel called me. His voice sounded slightly cautious. Mrs. Collins, he said, I think one of the tenants from Unit 2B will be stopping by the office today. I already knew who that was. Karen never liked waiting when she felt something was unfair. I understand, I said calmly. They're pretty upset about the rent increase, Daniel continued. That's not unusual, I replied. No, he agreed. But they specifically asked to speak with the owner. I looked down at the notebook on the table in front of me. Robert's handwriting was still visible on the pages I had been reviewing the night before. Then it sounds like we should schedule a meeting, I said. There was a small pause. Are you sure you want to meet them personally? Daniel asked. Yes. All right, he said. I'll let them know the owner will be available this afternoon. After we hung up, I sat quietly for a while. Outside the motel window, the sky was clear and bright. Cars moved steadily along the street, their tires humming softly against the pavement. Everything looked normal, but I knew the afternoon would be different. Karen still believed the building belonged to some distant investor. Someone she could complain about. Someone she could argue with. Someone she could blame. She didn't know the truth yet. A few hours later, I arrived at the property manager's office. It was located on the ground floor of the building, just beside the main entrance. Daniel greeted me at the door. She's already here, he said quietly. I nodded. Is she alone? Yes. Her husband had to work. That sounded like Mark. Karen had always been the one who handled the confrontations. Daniel led me down a short hallway toward the office. Through the glass window beside the door, I could see her. Karen sat in one of the chairs across from Daniel's desk. Her arms were crossed tightly. A folded lease notice rested on the table in front of her. Even from the hallway, I could see the frustration on her face. Daniel stopped walking. If you'd like, I can explain the situation first, he offered. That won't be necessary, I said. I reached for the door handle. For a brief moment, I thought about the last time I had seen my daughter, standing in her dining room, listening to her calmly explain that I was an extra mouth in her house. Life moves quickly sometimes. 2 weeks ago, I was the one standing quietly while she made decisions about where I belonged. Now things were different. I opened the door. Karen looked up immediately. For a second, confusion crossed her face. Mom, she said. Her eyes moved from me to Daniel, then back again. What are you doing here? I stepped into the office and closed the door behind me. Daniel remained near the wall, silent. Karen tapped the lease notice on the desk. Mom, I'm actually dealing with something important right now, she said impatiently. The landlord raised our rent to $3,000. I walked slowly toward the desk. Then I sat down in the chair across from her. Karen frowned. This isn't really the time for a visit, she added. I looked at the lease notice lying on the table. The number was printed clearly in bold letters. $3,000 per month. Then I looked back at my daughter and spoke calmly. Karen, I said, that's actually why I'm here. Karen stared at me across the desk, confusion slowly turning into irritation. Why are you here? She asked again. I rested my hands on the table beside the lease notice. You said you wanted to speak with the owner, I replied calmly. Karen frowned. Yes, but, she stopped mid-sentence. Her eyes moved slowly toward Daniel, who was standing quietly near the wall. Then back to me. The room suddenly felt very still. What do you mean? She asked. Daniel cleared his throat gently. Mrs. Collins purchased the building 2 weeks ago, he said. Karen blinked. For a moment, she didn't react at all. Then she laughed. A short, sharp laugh that sounded more like disbelief than humor. Wait, what? She said. Her eyes moved between us again. That's not funny. No one spoke. The silence lasted just long enough for the truth to settle. Karen's expression changed. The color drained from her face as she looked down at the lease notice in front of her. Then back at me. You're the owner? She asked slowly. Yes, I said. Another long silence filled the room. Karen leaned back in her chair, staring at me as if she were seeing a stranger. You bought the building? She said. Yes. When? About 2 weeks ago. Her eyebrows pulled together in confusion. That's impossible, she said. You moved out of our house with 1 suitcase. That's true. Karen looked down at the lease again. $3,000. Then back at me. So this rent increase. It came from the owner, I said. She pushed the paper across the desk slightly, her voice rising. Mom, this is ridiculous. You can't seriously expect us to pay this. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't lean forward. I simply sat there, the same way I had sat at her dinner table 2 weeks earlier. Karen shook her head. This has to be some kind of mistake. It isn't. She rubbed her forehead, trying to process everything at once. But why would you do this? She asked. The question hung in the air. Why? I looked at the lease notice again, then back at my daughter. Karen, I said quietly. Do you remember what you told me the night I left your house? Her eyes flickered. She knew exactly which night I meant. But she didn't answer. So I continued. You said I was an extra mouth? I reminded her. Karen shifted in her chair. That's not what I meant. I raised my hand slightly. Not to stop her, just to finish the thought. You explained that keeping another adult in your home was expensive, I said calmly. That you and Mark had practical concerns. Karen's shoulders stiffened. That was different, she said. Was it? I folded my hands together on the desk. You were making a practical decision, I continued. And now so am I. Karen stared at me. You're doing this to punish us, she said. I shook my head slowly. No, I replied. The market rate for these apartments is even higher. Daniel nodded quietly in the background. Karen looked from him to me again. But we can't afford this, she said. I held her gaze. Then you may need to make the same kind of decision you suggested for me. Her voice dropped. What decision? I answered calmly. Finding somewhere else to live. Karen stared at me as if she were trying to recognize someone she thought she knew. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The office was quiet except for the faint sound of traffic outside and the hum of the air conditioner above us. Finally, Karen leaned forward. You're serious? She asked. Yes, I said. Her eyes hardened. So this is revenge. I shook my head gently. No, I replied. This is business. Karen let out a sharp breath. You're my mother. And you're my tenant, I said calmly. The words settled heavily in the room. Karen looked down at the lease notice again, gripping the paper tightly between her fingers. You can't do this to family, she said. For a moment, I simply watched her. Then I answered quietly. You told me something important 2 weeks ago. Karen didn't look up. I continued. You explained that supporting another adult was expensive, that every household has limits. Her shoulders stiffened. That's not the same thing, isn't it? Karen finally lifted her head again. You were staying with us temporarily, she said. This is our home. I nodded slowly. And when I stayed with you, that was my home too. She opened her mouth, but nothing came out. Daniel remained silent against the wall. He understood this conversation wasn't really about rent anymore. Karen rubbed her temples. You could at least lower it, she said after a moment. Just for us. I thought about that. About the years Robert and I spent raising her. About the dinners, the school events, the long nights when she was sick and we stayed awake beside her bed. Parents spend a lifetime making space for their children. Sometimes we forget that children eventually decide whether to make space for us. I looked at her calmly. The other tenants are paying market rent, I said. That's not fair, Karen replied quickly. I gave a small nod. You're right. She looked up hopefully. It isn't fair. Her relief lasted only a second. Which is why everyone's rent is being adjusted the same way. The hope drained from her expression. Mom, she said quietly. I stood up from the chair. The conversation had reached its natural end. You have 30 days to decide whether you want to sign the new lease, I said. Karen stared at the paper again. Or what? She asked softly. Or you'll need to find another apartment. The same choice she once gave me. I walked toward the door. Behind me, Karen's voice came again. I never thought you'd do something like this. I paused for a moment with my hand on the door. Then I answered without turning around. Neither did I. And for the first time since my husband passed away, I understood something very clearly. Respect isn't something children automatically give their parents. Sometimes it has to be earned again. I left the office without looking back. The hallway outside felt quiet, the same way the world often feels. After something important has already happened, Daniel closed the door behind me and walked me toward the front entrance of the building. Neither of us spoke for a moment. When we reached the lobby, he paused. You handled that calmly, he said. I gave a small smile. At my age, you learn that calm usually works better than anger. Daniel nodded. Your husband used to say the same thing. That made me pause. Robert always believed that the strongest decisions didn't need loud voices, just clear ones. Outside, the late afternoon sun had begun to settle over the street. The brick walls of the building glowed softly in the warm light. For a moment, I simply stood there looking up at it. 3 floors, 8 apartments, dozens of quiet lives happening behind those windows. Robert had spent years building something solid here. Not just an investment, a foundation. And now, in a way I never expected, it had become the foundation under my own feet. That evening I moved into one of the empty units on the top floor. It wasn't the largest apartment in the building, but it had a small balcony that overlooked the street. I unpacked my suitcase slowly. A few sweaters, a framed photo of Robert, and the small notebook he used to keep in his desk drawer. By the time the sun disappeared, the apartment was quiet and comfortable. Not luxurious, but peaceful. A few days later, Daniel told me Karen had made her decision. She and Mark found another apartment across town. Smaller, more expensive, but available immediately. They moved out before the end of the month. I didn't stop them. I didn't ask them to stay. Some lessons are easier to understand when distance gives people time to think. Weeks passed. The building continued running smoothly. Tenants paid their rent. Maintenance requests came and went. Life settled into a steady rhythm. Sometimes in the evening, I would sit on the balcony with a cup of tea and watch the lights come on in the apartments below. It reminded me of something Robert used to say when we talked about property. A good building takes care of the people inside it. At the time, I thought he meant plumbing and roofs and repairs. Now I understood he meant something deeper. A place where people feel respected. A place where they belong. One afternoon, about 2 months later, my phone rang. Karen's name appeared on the screen. I answered. Hello. Her voice was quieter than I remembered. Hi, Mom. We talked for a few minutes. Nothing dramatic. Just small things. Work. The weather. Life. Before we hung up, she hesitated. Mom, I'm sorry about what I said that night. I didn't rush to respond. Some apologies take time to reach the right words. I know, I said finally. And I meant it. Because people grow. Sometimes slowly. Sometimes only after life pushes them to see things differently. That night, I stepped onto the balcony again. The city lights stretched across the distance. Below me, the building stood quietly, just as Robert had always planned. Strong. Steady. And for the first time since losing him, I felt something settle peacefully inside my chest. Karen once believed I was just an extra mouth. But life has a way of reminding us of something important. Sometimes the person people think they can push aside turns out to be the one holding the keys all along.